and most recently the gamma secretase inhibitors, where we already have a couple of them now. So let's start with the anti-hormonal therapy. I won't spend too much time on that, but as you know, we only have case reports here and very small series. The response rates vary up to 50%, but you always have to keep in mind that there is a great bias in there because there are only a lot of case reports. There is no clear rationale for this treatment, and the evidence is very low. But still, a lot of countries in Europe use it because it's easy available, the costs are low, and the side effects are rather low. But in all our position papers and guidelines, we did not give a general recommendation for anti-hormonal therapy. So this is an old overview of some of the studies there, and you can see that most of them are case reports or very small numbers of patients. The first and only prospective study in this respect, evaluating tamoxifen and solindac, by the way, comes from the pediatric population. This was a study, 59 patients treated with this combination of tamoxifen and solindac for up to 1 year, but only 10 patients of these 60 could actually complete this 1 year of therapy without progression or withdrawal. The overall response rate was 88%, and the 2-year progression-free survival rate was 36%, which is, by the way, the same as in the placebo arm of the phase 3 sorafenib study. So taken together, this was the first and only prospective study evaluating this with rather low response rates or rates in terms of overall response and progression-free survival rates. Chemotherapy, we have different regimens here. You know, methotrexate vinblastine. There is the combination of methotrexate and vinorelbine or vinorelbine alone. We have, of course, anthracycline-based regimens, which more or less comes from the treatment of soft tissue sarcoma or of sarcomas in general. And we have this pegylated liposomal doxorubicin, which is more or less a special form of doxorubicin with less cardiac toxicity and less side effects. So the indication for chemotherapy are clearly a small minority of patients, I would say, the non-resectable, really rapidly growing and or symptomatic or even life-threatening desmoid tumors. This is fortunately, of course, not very often the case, and they should preferably be treated with chemotherapy. There is, again, a prospective study looking at the combination of methotrexate and vinblastine, again from the pediatric population, phase 2 study, only 28 patients with this combination up to 1 year. Overall response rate 19%. Again, this is in the range of the placebo arm in the sorafenib study. And 8 patients remained free of progression at a median of 40 months. So as in summary, the combination demonstrated a progression arrest in about 1/3, 30% of the patients. And it is still, this combination is still the choice, the treatment of choice in the pediatric patient population. But more and more also it is used for the adult patients as well. So this is an overview of the different possible chemotherapy regimens. But of course, we have absolutely no randomized studies for that. The French sarcoma group did a retrospective analysis, and they looked at different chemotherapies, conventional chemotherapies, 62 patients. 71% were treated with combination therapies, 29% were treated with monotherapy, and 21% were treated with an anthracycline-based chemotherapy. Here are the responses. There were 2% complete responses, 19% partial responses, and 60% had a disease stabilization and about 20% with a disease progression. They compared the different regimens and could clearly demonstrate that the response rate is higher for the regimens which contain an anthracycline. This was quite evident here. So I would say if you really go for chemotherapy and you need a response, a rather rapid response, then you should go for an anthracycline-based regimen. But of course, this is not very often the case. And especially in the young patient population, pegylated liposomal doxorubicin may be preferred because of less cardiac and also less other toxicities. These were the regimens which were evaluated here, quite a number of them. Okay, this takes me then to the next topic. These are the targeted therapies, and that began more or less with imatinib. That was by that time where imatinib was very popular, I would say, because of the GIST therapies, where it was very useful and very helpful. So they started here with the US, with a small US phase 2 study, 19 patients who were treated with 800 milligram imatinib, which is a quite high dose already. Overall response rate was 16%. This study was followed by the study from the French Sarcoma group, phase 2 study with 35 patients, treated with a half of the dose, 400 milligram imatinib daily. The overall response rate was rather low here with only 11%, and progression arrest rates were at 3, 6, and 12 month, 90, 80, and around 70%. 2-year progression-free survival rate, 55%, so half of the patients had no progression at 2 years, and overall survival rate, of course, very high, but fortunately, not many patients die from this disease. So also in Germany, we looked at imatinib in these patients, and one of the differences of our study compared to the other imatinib studies was that we really required a RECIST progressive disease, which actually means that the increase of the tumor before inclusion into this study has to be at least 20%, which was, by the way, not so easy, because a lot of patients we saw by that time showed a kind of increase of the desmoid, but often the 20% mark was not reached. So, and we couldn't include them in the study then. So imatinib induced sustained progression arrest in these patients, and we presented and also published all the final results here. Okay, this was more or less the imatinib story. This was followed then, and this is of course a milestone trial in the desmoid tumor clinical research, because it was actually the first randomized phase 3 study we ever had in this disease. It was published by my colleague Mirnal from New York, and so there was a comparison between sorafenib and placebo. By the way, also in this trial, there was no RECIST progression required for the inclusion of patients. So sorafenib was clearly better than placebo. The response rate, by the way, was something like 33% in the sorafenib arm. But, and this is interesting to see, also in the placebo arm, we had an overall response rate of 20%. So, and this very much tells us something about the natural history of this disease, that even without doing anything, without any treatment, we have quite a high number, which varies according to the literature, between 10 and 20% of regression or of a response without any treatment. This trial, or this publication and this trial, was followed by another important randomized trial from our French colleagues, the Desmoid study. This trial compared pazopanib, another TKI, a multi-tyrosine kinase inhibitor, against a chemotherapy combination of methotrexate and vinblastine, which is, I already talked about that, which is more or less a very established chemotherapy, especially in the pediatric and young adult population. This was a phase 2 study, randomized open label study. And the primary endpoint, this is depicted here somewhere, is the proportion of patients who had not progressed at 6 months, which was, by the way, the same primary endpoint as in our German imatinib study, and this was 84% for pazopanib, and it was only 45% for the chemotherapy combination. So again, this study could show an advantage, or was in favor of the tyrosine kinase inhibitor compared to a chemotherapy in this respect. So the next group of drugs are now the gamma secretase inhibitors, and these are of course the most recently studied drugs, and also maybe the most interesting drugs, because in comparison, or in contrast to all the other drugs I have already presented to you, here we have a clear rationale for that. So there is a clear molecular explanation why these gamma secretase inhibitors can work or should work in desmoid tumors. And nirogacestat is the first example for that, and this is the very small phase 2 study with only 17 patients, which more or less led to the idea that nirogacestat can be helpful in desmoid tumors. Small study with the majority of females, which represents the actual proportion in the patient population. And if you look at the responses here, maybe not so easy to understand that. This graph shows the change in tumor size. So everything which is minus is tumor regression, and everything which is here in the plus part is of course increase in tumor size. And here you can see the definition of what we call progressive disease. This is something up here, because this would be an increase of the tumor size of more than 20%. But as you can see here, none of the patients had progressive disease, because none of the patients showed an increase of tumor size of more than 20%. And here the 30% in the minus part is a tumor regression, and a tumor regression of more than 30%, we call that a partial response. So as you can see here, some of the patients, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, had a partial response, and all these patients who were in between these 20% plus and 30% minus, we call that stable disease. So you can see here that all of the patients had at least stable disease, and there was no patient with a progressive disease. So more or less all the patients somehow responded from that therapy. And this, of course, this very small phase 2 study was the basis for going further. Oh, I forgot that. These are the side effects from this small study. And as you can see here, nirogacestat is a quite well-tolerable drug. There are hardly any grade 3 side effects. We had a number of grade 2 side effects in these patients. Most of the side effects were grade 1, which is the lowest grading, of course. And as you can see here, the most important ones are maybe diarrhea. We have nausea in some patients, and we have quite typically these transaminase elevations at least in a number of patients, and also some other laboratory findings are sometimes found in these patients. But overall, it is very well tolerated, especially if you compare that, for example, to something like sorafenib. It is much better tolerated in terms of side effects than these tyrosine kinase inhibitors. So this phase 2 study was actually the basis for designing the next study, which is the currently running phase 3 study, which is called the DeFi study, nirogacestat for adults with desmoid tumors, aggressive fibromatosis, which was set up from SpringWorks, the company which took over this this compound, which was initially developed by Pfizer. And this is the design of this study. We have a randomization of nirogacestat versus placebo. And for those patients who are progressive in the placebo arm, they have the chance to we say, cross over to an open label nirogacestat arm. That means every patient in the study has the chance to receive the drug if there is a real disease progression. So if you end up in the placebo arm and you show a disease progression in the meantime, then you can still receive nirogacestat. The primary endpoint of this study is what we call the progression-free survival, and these are the secondary endpoints: safety, of course, overall response rate, duration of response. This trial started recruitment already in 2019, in May 2019, and it finalized recruitment in summer last year. So the whole recruitment time was about 1 year, and altogether, I think 140 patients at the end were recruited here. And currently, of course, patients are on treatment, and we are eagerly awaiting, of course, the results from that study. But I think we still need a bit of patience for that. And but we are, of course, looking forward to that. But from my own experience, I can tell you that it definitely works. So the majority of the patients really benefit from this treatment, and it's really good to see how the desmoid tumors shrink under this therapy. We have now another compound, another gamma secretase inhibitor on the table, which is called AL102 from Ayala. That's the reason why it's called AL. And the study, which is currently starting up, is called the Ringside study. A bit difficult, perhaps, to understand, but it's quite easy to explain that. This study is a kind of combined phase 2, phase 3 study. So we start here with a phase 2 part, and the idea of this phase 2 part is just to find out the optimal dose of this compound, which will then, and the selected regimen will then taken to the phase 3 part of the study. This will be a randomization 2-to-1 against placebo, so more or less it's the same design, or it's a similar design, at least, as we had before. And in this phase 3 part of the study, around 150 patients will be treated with this compound against placebo. And again, we have the chance, or there is what we call crossover option in here. That means patients in the placebo arm, under the circumstances they do show a progressive disease, they can cross over to the open label extension, we call that, though, which actually means that they can still receive the actual drug. So this is the trial which is currently starting, or I think it already started in the US with a couple of centers, and we are hopefully also soon starting in some countries in Europe and Israel. So that's the current situation here. So I put together in a kind of efficacy summary the response rates here and the efficacy data for these different trials and different studies. These are all the imatinib studies. This is the sorafenib data from the phase 3 study. Here we have the data for pazopanib in the Desmoid study, and the latest on the data for nirogacestat, but only from this very small phase 2 study, of course, because the phase 3 study is still ongoing. Okay, let's summarize the medical treatments here. As I said before, we didn't give any recommendation for the use of anti-hormonal therapies in all of our position papers. Chemotherapy may be indicated in rapidly growing and or symptomatic or even life-threatening, which is fortunately very seldom. Desmoid tumors, methotrexate vinblastine is the chemotherapy of choice in the pediatric patient population. And for the young patients, the AYA patients, the pegylated liposomal doxorubicin may be preferred. We have the tyrosine kinase inhibitors, especially those two, which have been or which clearly demonstrated clinical activity in a randomized setting and move into the focus of interest. And of course, the gamma secretase inhibitors promise to be effective agents. And here currently these two studies are ongoing with nirogacestat and the second one from Ayala, this AL102. But, and this is important to notice, if you look at all these drugs, of course, these are still under evaluation, but also sorafenib, pazopanib, imatinib, also pegylated liposomal doxorubicin. The majority of all these drugs do not have, or all these drugs do not have a formal registration for desmoids, and therefore are in a lot of countries in Europe not available or not reimbursed. This is very different in the different countries. In Germany, for example, it is usually quite easy to give these drugs off-label, but in other countries like Italy or so, it is completely impossible. Okay, I would like to, at the end, to put that into the perspective of our global consensus paper. So these were the recommendations at the end for the available medical therapies. Due to the lack of comparative studies, of course, we are still not able to really propose a definitive to really propose a definitive order of the existing systemic treatment options. Randomized data only exist for sorafenib, pazopanib, and this chemotherapy combination. In general, it is usually reasonable to employ the less toxic therapy initially and then initiate the more toxic ones in a stepwise fashion. What we did is we came up with a kind of 5-dimensional model which takes into account all these parameters here. I will not go into detail here. This is not so important. What is much more important, of course, is this treatment algorithm, which was over the last few years a bit modified. But the most important thing here is that after the diagnosis, we clearly advocate for this active surveillance as the frontline approach in the majority of patients, and only in case of progression, then according or depending on the localization of the desmoid tumor, we go for different treatment strategies. Just to summarize that in a few words. So we published this global consensus paper in the European Journal of Cancer, and we also put that together in a nice publication or in a nicer layout, I would say, which was very much supported by Sarcoma Patients Euronet. This is available in a booklet form, and it is also available, of course, electronically. You can download it from the SPAEN website. You can also download it from the website of the Desmoid Tumor Research Foundation. This is, I think this is my last slide. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. I hope I could give you a kind of overview for that, and you can see a lot of things are ongoing. And of course, we are very eagerly awaiting the results of the SpringWorks trial and these trials with the gamma secretase inhibitors. Thank you very much.